I digress. Let's get back to this guy. His agenda was called the Great Society. It was supposed to eliminate poverty and racial injustice, which was basically welfare, which sounds great, but there were all these stipulations. And you had no privacy. They had the right to all of your information, financial, whereabouts of relatives, and you had to take a loyalty oath, which just says that you'll comply. You had the standard of moral behavior where if you had an illegitimate child, after you went on the program, you got cut off unless you could prove that there was not a man in the house. They used clauses from the Elizabethan Poor Laws. They were used to distinguish the vagrant, the voluntarily unemployed, and the helpless. So you had to provide financial care for any indigent member of your family that could not care for themselves with the money they gave you. As far as housing, they made it really difficult to get into the areas that they had designated if you weren't already a resident of there. These programs are sounding great. As far as the jobs they offered on the unemployment program, the jobs were out of their skill set or extremely dangerous. So if they declined or didn't do a good job, they got cut off or criminally prosecuted. Public housing chose the people that were allowed to live there based on income, police record, and the company you kept. And they gave home visits. And if they didn't like it, they could kick you out at any time. These are great. My personal favorite, though, in order to keep the money they were giving you, you had to prove that there was no illicit relationships going on. Maybe you had a man in the house, I don't know, because he was the dad of your kids and you just weren't married. Sounds like the beginning of the breakdown of the family unit, if you ask me. It basically took over your budget by paying your rent directly to the place that they chose for you to live. I'm thinking that Great Society ain't looking so great. Popularity was declining, so he did not seek re-election. So we'll move on to Richard Nixon. He was a Republican, and he served as a vice president from 1953 to 1961. He's mostly known for the Watergate scandal, but we'll get to that. He created the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. He ended the draft, but I'm sure soldiers would have differing opinions about that. I'm not going to speak on that. He was also the first one to try to introduce universal health care, called Nixon Care, for everybody. The Democrats said it wasn't liberal enough and voted against it. He lowered the voting age, which people were complaining because they were old enough to go to war, but they weren't old enough to vote on that war. Again, some people have different sides. And he took the first step to start affirmative action. They tried to fight it, saying that it closely resembled quotas, which were illegal under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but Nixon threatened to keep both chambers in session over the Christmas break of 1969, so Congress approved it. In the 1968 election, all of the candidates were asked about the war on crime. So we'll move on to Watergate. Nixon found out that Johnson had installed a recording system to record his meetings and telephone calls in the White House, but he had it removed and installed his own on February 16, 1971. It looked like this. Started off in the Oval Office in the Cabinet Room, but he extended it to his private office and later Camp David. It was monitored by the Secret Service, and the tapes were stored in a room in the White House basement. They also had the phone lines tapped in significant rooms. The tape's existence came to light during the televised testimony of White House aide Alexander Butterfield before the Senate Watergate Committee, and the tapes are available if you ever want to listen to them. But there's an 18.5-minute gap. His secretary was dictating the notes, and she accidentally pressed record when she went to answer a phone call. She insisted she was not responsible for the remaining 13 minutes. But the gap is during a conversation between Nixon and his chief of staff, Haldeman, 3 days after the Watergate break-in. Haldeman also wrote a book. And it's called Watergate because there was 2 break-ins into the Watergate office building in D.C. where the Democratic National Committee headquarters was. And these men put together Operation Gemstone. One of the plans was to kidnap radical Democratic leaders that might cause trouble at the Republican convention. The other plan was just to use wiretaps. But when they testified, they all 4 said they never agreed to break into the Watergate offices. So they started the articles of impeachment and Nixon resigned.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation. Each time I have done so to discuss with you some matter that I believe affected the national interest. In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation.
Google says the tapes revealed that Nixon had conspired to cover up activities that took place after the break-in and had attempted to use federal officials to deflect the investigation. So they started impeachment for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. But we still don't know what they were looking for. These two reporters from the Washington Post broke the story that there was an illegal slush fund for all of the criminal activities they were engaging in. It implicated the U.S. Justice Department, the FBI, CIA, and eventually the White House. And Deep Throat, who they later said was FBI Associate Director Mark Felt. In the journalist's book about Deep Throat, he referred to him as an incurable gossip, and they would have these clandestine meetings set up through the New York Times and some moving of the flower pots. But the people that investigated this claim said that it was factually impossible by the way that the New York Times was set out. It wasn't for individuals, and there was no way for them to know which paper was going to which apartment. Other people said he was mad because he was looked over in his position. Then I found this man, James Rothstein, the first police detective from the NYPD assigned to investigate the prostitution industry. And he discovered that it had to do with politicians and child prostitutes.
You can even look at the Watergate break-in was strictly based on one thing, the pedophile records that were being kept at the Democratic National Headquarters, not only the prostitution ring, but the pedophile ring. And the reason they broke in there was to get that list, we call it the book, where you identify all your customers, how much they spend, what their sexual proclivities are, and all of this stuff. And this was the level that we had gone to, even to that level. And there were many cases like this with United States government leaders, foreign government leaders. Yes, this happens on a regular